Thank you very much, moderator. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm very pleased to participate in this important meeting, and I, like the previous speaker, would really love to be with you in Kenya, but wasn't able to travel. So it's good to be with you virtually. To start with, and I've been asked to talk a little bit about current BMZ's priorities, and particularly, of course, with regard to economic development, but also more broadly where we are in these difficult and challenging times at the moment. So to start with, let me say and reconfirm all of you that Africa as a continent continues to be the most important partner region of BMZ, the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, which I'm representing today. Currently, Africa, and we are working with a total of 33 bilateral partner countries on the continent in very close collaboration through bilateral programs. And currently this region is receiving more than half of our financial resources of BMZ's budget across all instruments, bilaterally, but also through multilateral cooperation, European Commission, but also the World Bank, the African Development Bank, UN agencies, and so on. So more than 50% of our resources, just talking about quantity, are dedicated to our cooperation with the African continent. And I think that is already, in terms of priorities, a strong statement. And I think this regional focus is really wisely chosen and in our own interest, as we jointly, as neighboring continents, need to address, or, you know, as Europeans and Germans in support of the African continent, to address the huge dual challenge that the continent is facing. On the one hand, rapidly and sustainably expanding the economies, labor markets, infrastructure, and also skills to create the necessary jobs. And I think I already made a strong case on job creation as well for the youth of the continent, the growing number of young people that are moving onto the labor markets. And also, secondly, to address this economic transformation in a climate neutral way, in a sustainable way, as this is really the way in the future, and we have all signed up to the Paris Agreement, and that goes with it. Before I address these challenges in more detail, let me briefly outline the current political priorities of my ministry and my leadership that came into office only last December. December seems far away looking at the current situation and everything that is happening, but still we are basically in the process of dealing with the current crisis here in Europe and still following through with the political priorities that have been set by this leadership last December. And these are, let me just go through them, 4 priority areas: addressing the COVID-19, addressing the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact. Albert has touched on this already. Second, fighting hunger and poverty, reaching SDG 2 in principle. 3, enabling a just and economic and also energy transition. And 4, and this is maybe something to talk a bit about later, implementing a feminist development policy, really putting equal rights at the center of whatever we do. In addition, there are 2 focal areas that need our attention. One is digitalization. I think Albert has spoken about this at extent already, as a cross-cutting area of our work, and also the area of migration, looking at the situation that we have more than 100 million refugees at the moment on this continent and on this planet Earth. This needs our attention as well. Overall, and I think this is important for GIZ as a bilateral implementing organization of German cooperation, the new leadership here in BMZ also puts a very strong focus on cooperation with multilateral actors, particularly the EU, our European partners, but also with institutions like the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and so on. So this, I think, kind of cooperation, bilateral, multilateral, in the end, helps us to work better together and to achieve greater impact with whatever we do. With regard to these priorities outlined, let me just highlight a couple of points and also challenges. Looking at COVID-19, the pandemic and its impact, we were looking at a situation where economies were slowly recovering from the crisis and the pandemic. Now the war, the Russian, aggression against Ukraine hits the global economy and also political and security stability. On top of that crisis, economies on the African continent were slowly recovering, maybe more slowly than, for example, here in Europe and the US, but recovery was there. But now we have this major setback through the crisis. Looking at the impact of the pandemic, I think just specifically to address this issue, besides dealing with the short-term needs, I understand that still, working on vaccination campaigns and so on the African continent remains a short-term need. But in the more medium to long-term perspective, in a reaction to this pandemic, investing in health systems and health sovereignty on the African continent is a real priority for the German government and for BMZ. And hopefully also for all African governments, as health is a human right and the basis for so many other things. So BMZ is strongly engaged in strengthening health systems. Do this in close collaboration, for example, with the AU, the African CDC, but of course also bilaterally with governments. As part of this, and this is really a bit new in terms of the policy environment, strengthening local production, local supply chains for medical products and vaccines has become really a strong focus of our work. And I think the issue of diversifying manufacturing, diversifying supply chains is one of the lessons learned from this pandemic, that we need to do better and also to prepare better for future pandemics, that this is a wise investment to take, and the German government stands ready to support partner countries in this endeavor. And in this spirit, strengthening, for example, health infrastructure is also one of the priorities of the current G7 presidency that Germany holds. I already touched briefly on the impact of the current crisis in Europe, and already said the setbacks of the COVID-19 pandemic that has undone years of development progress. We've seen the first recession in 25 years due to the pandemic, and now we have the war against Ukraine on top of things. Which puts additional stress on economies worldwide, but particularly on many African economies that will most likely face, due to the inflation, to the rise in prices of key products, will most likely face a hunger crisis, most likely face a debt crisis, or are already in a debt crisis. In some countries, that is unfortunately already the case. So looking at these crisis scenarios, we certainly see a danger also of political stability, losing ground in terms of political stability, and countries' economies increasingly becoming threatened by these developments that we need to address. We as BMZ, as I started by saying, the new government has come up with these 4 priorities which I outlined in the beginning, and now due to the war against Ukraine, we somehow also need to adjust in the way of working without losing sight of the medium to long-term challenges. We have reacted quite quickly to this war situation here in Europe. And I think one of the key messages is that we do have a war in Europe, but we must also not lose sight of the implications of that crisis on particularly the African continent, but also areas of this world, particularly in the global south. So my minister at the G7 ministerial meeting 2 weeks ago launched, to address the immediate hunger and food crisis issue, a global alliance for food security, which will be implemented together with partners in cooperation with the World Bank, but also other multilateral and bilateral partners. And the aim is to facilitate a rapid, forward-looking international response to address the looming hunger crisis, and more importantly, from a development perspective, to also use this challenge, this crisis, as hopefully an opportunity to address in the medium to long term the transformation of food and agricultural systems that is overdue anyway, that has, should have happened a long time ago, but now to really look at how can the African continent become more sovereign, again, sovereignty here in terms of nutrition, in terms of food production, strengthening local supply chains, than it has been done in the past. So the emergency response is what this alliance, global alliance for food security, is supposed to achieve, but also to address the medium to long-term challenges in this agricultural sector. And we all know that agricultural development remains a key issue in many African countries and economies. It's still the backbone in many economies, and particularly with regard to jobs, agriculture is the key sector where people find employment. So it is really important, and hopefully, as German cooperation, we can support partner countries on the African continent to manage this transformation also of food and agricultural systems. That is a real priority for us now for the coming years. Let me address another consequence that also of the current crisis, the war against Ukraine. But again, here it's a short-term issue, but it's been on the table for a long time also with regard to medium to long-term strategies. How can we use this crisis with regard to energy supply, energy production, to do what we need to do anyway, and that is secure, ensure energy safety and security, and safe energy supply, but at the same time manage the transformation of energy systems to move towards a climate neutral path with regard to the Paris Agreement and the 1.5 degree path that we all have signed up to follow through. And we all know that the situation, for example, here in Germany and in many African countries, is very different. But the overall objective of climate neutrality, I think, is one that we are in jointly. And as a response to this crisis, the transformation, the diversification of energy supply has become a major issue here in Europe in an unforeseen manner, but is also an issue for many African countries. I think there are opportunities to work on together. Turning now more to economic development, role of the private sector, and so on in our cooperation with Africa. We all know that we need the private sector as an engine for job creation. It's the private sector that creates most of the jobs. Since 2018, BMZ has supported many countries, but particularly our so-called reform partnership countries, that explicitly aim to improve the general conditions for private sector development in line with the objectives of the Compact with Africa. I think Albert already made reference to the Compact with Africa earlier. As part of this package, improving the general framework conditions is important, but also investing in skills and training and in finance, which is key for private sector development. We all know that taking an honest look at these reform partnerships, I must say there is sort of good progress, but in other areas we also haven't made the headway we wanted to see. And I think in many countries, We still see the state dominating the market, at least in certain sectors, for example, the financial sector, but also other economic sectors. So that remains a real issue when we talk about economic development and private sector development to be addressed. Also looking at the investment needs for infrastructure, but also looking at health, education, other investment needs, the mobilization of private capital, particularly for infrastructure investment, is a key priority. And we are trying with our instruments, now here we have GIZ, but we also have KfW as a financing institution. We are trying to contribute in this area. We strongly engaged in discussing instruments, particularly with regard to blending via KfW, but also in collaboration with the multilateral development banks, to really make headway to address these infrastructure needs, which are in the billions and billions. And it's clear that this infrastructure investment is the basis for economic development in many countries, whether it's roads, whether it's the digital infrastructure that's needed, and energy I've already touched upon earlier. We see enormous potential in the mega project of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Albert has already touched on it earlier as well. This is a key African initiative which we are supporting as the largest bilateral funder, Germany at the moment, with a total of 78 million euros. And, if the projections are right, up to 30 million people can or are to be lifted out of extreme poverty through this initiative if it is implemented. So that is a key priority for our cooperation as well. I've already touched upon the economic transformation on the way to climate neutrality. That is a priority of the German government. Though, as I said earlier already, with the crisis in Ukraine, we are now also discussing energy diversification. But still, in terms of policy, for us, it remains important that we do not lose track of the important climate neutral path that will be needed so that climate change will not destroy everything. And of course, for the African continent, climate adaptation is also a key issue. So we are, just to give a couple of examples, engaging very broadly with many partner countries in energy, in the energy sector, with the objective of moving into a just energy transition. The just certainly means that we do not lose sight of the social dimension of these transformation processes, and at the same time take advantage of the huge potential, particularly in Africa, for renewable energies that can be such a game changer if the necessary finance for the investments in these sectors and the necessary regulatory framework for these investments is put in place. And Germany wants to play a role in supporting these processes. There are a couple of pilot programs, as I said earlier, in a socially just way. With South Africa, we have engaged in a just energy transition partnership that really focuses on moving out of coal production into cleaner production of energy, and to do it in a socially just way so that workers that are currently engaged in coal production do not lose their jobs but are offered alternatives. So really harvesting the tremendous potential for climate neutral power generation in Africa is a key priority for us, with a view to, as policy, and with the view to economic development and fostering economic development. As we all know, without energy, there is no economic development possible. Let me now turn to another important area that is the fourth priority of my minister, which I outlined in the beginning, a feminist development policy. I think we all know that economic development, and particularly the development of society at large, is not possible without women's economic empowerment and promoting women's rights. we're talking about more than 50% of the population, and they must be part of the solution. That is quite clear. I think it's quite historic that it was the first G7 development ministers meeting where ministers made a case for a feminist development policy. That's quite a strong statement, and this puts the issue of gender really at the center of our policy. I think key here is that we are focusing on a rights-based approach, because we all know that when human rights in general and women's rights in particular are respected, economic development and also societal development at large will benefit. Their implications are huge. In Africa too, women are central agents of change who we want to empower and strengthen. And we do believe that we need to expand targeted support for women and entrepreneurs, but also for education and training for girls and women. And I'm sure many people in this room have a lot to say about this and a lot of experience to bring to the table. In our first analysis, though we have half of all ongoing projects in Africa address gender equality, only few programs at the moment really address gender as a primary objective. It's mostly a secondary objective, and I think we need to work together to do better here and to put gender equality really at the center of all our work, and make it in many more cases a principal objective of our programs. So ambitious gender mainstreaming and an ambitious gender strategy is and will be critical. Of course, also previously I talked about the path to climate neutrality, the socio-ecological transformation that needs to take place. This needs to be done in a gender equal way. That is quite clear. We want women and men to be able to participate equally, and I think there are good examples out there from which we can learn. Lastly, on employment and job creation, I think we all know that this is really at the heart of the solution to many other issues, particularly with regard to the youth. There are calculations that Africa requires 25 million jobs per year in order to give young people a perspective. We think that as German cooperation, we have quite a bit to bring to the table, from skills development, vocational training and education, which is strongly associated with German cooperation, and we stand ready to continue that cooperation, but also with a view to really supporting that transformation of the economy that is needed. I think hopefully we can sort of bring investment in skills for youth, for young people, together with the skills that are needed for the transformation of the economy I talked about earlier. The previous government already put in place, and I think this is an initiative which will actually be strengthened, is a special initiative on training and job creation, which addresses specifically the needs of young people and of key industries that really have a future, whether it's the digital economy or, as I discussed earlier, a transformed agricultural economy with supply chains that have potential, and to really look at the formalized sector as well. Look at decent jobs that can be created. To really give a perspective to young people. This is a real priority for us. Digitalization, I'm not going to say a lot. Albert has spoken to this. I just want to at least mention it, that it's of course a cross-cutting area. We need to have digitalization integrated by default in all programs to really reap and harvest the opportunities that come with digitalization without losing sight of the risks, looking at data safety, a rights-based approach to data, and so on. But the potential is huge. as a priority, BMZ invests in this area in sort of the regulatory framework for digitalization in innovative solutions, startups, entrepreneurship, but of course also in infrastructure, as access to the internet remains a key bottleneck on the African continent, and Albert has spoken to this. And we do this in close cooperation with the EU as a partner. To close, I don't want to close without saying a few words about GIZ. GIZ is one of our most important implementing organizations in the German cooperation system. You know, we have many institutions in the German system, but GIZ is certainly a key player here. It's highly regarded as an institution. It has a key role to play in Germany with regard to advice to the ministry, but also sensitization here in Germany, but particularly, of course, on the ground in partner countries. We value the long-standing and close cooperation, the relationships with partner governments, but also other partners, non-state actors, and so on, the private sector, science, research, institutions on the African continent. That's sort of the backbone of our cooperation, and we're very glad to have GIZ at our side. We value GIZ for the innovations and also for developing new approaches, for thinking outside the box, and also echoing here, to the ministry where the real challenges are on the continent. We do expect GIZ and all people working with GIZ sitting in this room to, of course, work with GIZ, but also to work together really closely with the sister organization for financial cooperation, KfW. We think together we are strong. KfW and GIZ, with their comparative advantages brought together to the table, I believe German cooperation can make an impact and can add value to the development that African governments and African players see for themselves happening in the coming years. Thank you very much for your attention.